How many people here have heard of OpenAPI? Raise your hand. Awesome. How many people here use OpenAPI for something other than creating fancy documentation? Ooh, okay, good. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to leverage OpenAPI for awesome APIs. So hi, my name is Erin Mckean. I run Wordnik.com, which is the biggest dictionary in the world that no one has ever heard of. It's a nonprofit. It's a 501c3, and Chad would be really happy with how we've organized our team because it's the smallest possible team size. One, that's me. We have, in addition to the website, wordnik.com, we also have an API that is creeping up on 25,000 registered developers. So I'm the only person who works on this, so I like to call myself a full stack overflow developer. And if you feel the need to tweet anything that I have said, that is my Twitter handle. It is also my GitHub handle. And I really love APIs. I like them. I like the plumbing of the internet. And OpenAPI, I think, makes APIs more awesome. So what is OpenAPI? So I did say that I work on a dictionary. And so I occasionally, not all the time, but every once in a while, I like to give definitions. So here's what OpenAPI is. And I've bolded the important words. It's a standard. It's something people agree on. It's language agnostic. We don't care what language your API is written in. It's an interface to REST API, so all you GraphQL haters, just be patient. It allows both humans and computers to discover and understand what's actually going on with your API without access to the source code, which you probably don't want to give randos, to your documentation, because let's be honest, people don't often read the documentation, even when you make it very pretty, and without having to inspect network traffic, which honestly is a cool thing to do, but maybe not something you want to do just to figure out how this random third-party API behaves. So that's what the OpenAPI initiative and the OpenAPI Spec is all about. So some of you right now might be saying, Erin, isn't that just Swagger? And yes, it is. So the OpenAPI initiative is the new name of the spec formerly known as Swagger. What I like to say is that Swagger is no longer called Swagger, it just still has Swagger. So an interesting and irrelevant historical fact is that I'm the founder of Wordnik as well as the full stack overflow developer, but we originally started not as a nonprofit, but as a venture-backed startup. And my technical co-founder at Wordnik, Tony Tam, is the person who invented Swagger back in 2010 for Wordnik. And I like to joke that he came up with Swagger because he was really tired of me asking him what the parameters were for certain API calls. So it solved a very, very important problem, because when the CEO is going, what's the parameter for this? I really want to know. You really don't want to get those emails at like 2 in the morning. So he came up with Swagger in late 2010. It was open sourced, I think, even a little later that year or early 2011. Things get fuzzy. We very happily supported it, had fun with it, encouraged people to use it. But it was kind of outgrowing what the company at the time was called Reverb could handle. And there was another company called SmartBear that was making a whole lot of Swagger tools if you use Swagger Editor. And so Reverb handed the open source project of Swagger over to SmartBear. SmartBear ran with it for a little while and then realized, hey, this is even bigger than us, bigger than SmartBear, even though we make all these tools, because so many people are using what was then called Swagger. So then it was given as a project, the OpenAPI initiative, to the Linux Foundation, where it happily lives today. So yes, it is Swagger. It has a slightly more green logo now. And now Swagger is version 2.0. OpenAPI Spec is now version 3.0. Everybody clear? Catch up with me later if you need even more info. I could talk about this for hours. So here's what an OpenAPI spec looks like in its most abstract form. There's information about your API, like what is it called? Information about the servers. What kind of security is attached to the API? Is it OAuth? Is it basic auth? Just a key? What paths or endpoints are you actually describing? Tags, which is kind of a internal thing that lets you group your endpoints by something that makes sense to humans. Like when you have documentation, you might want to have all your endpoints that are related to users be in one lump. External docs, that's exactly what it says on the box. It links to external documentation. And then you have your components, which are basically a reusable box of things that you can attach to any part of your spec. So you might have different APIs that have the same headers, so only define those once. And then you can use them other places in the spec. And this is what it looks like in YAML, because everybody really loves reading YAML. So here you say, there's our info block. It says the title, our awesome API, which delivers awesome over REST. There's its version. There are servers. We can have a production server and a staging server indicated, as many servers as you want. Then, okay, what we've got a get. It's got a summary. Here are the kinds of responses you can expect, say, perhaps a JSON array of awesome, and so on and so forth. This should look pretty familiar. I have a strong preference for JSON because I also run the Semicolon Appreciation Society. But I think it's evil to make people read JSON on a screen. But you can have your spec in both YAML and JSON if you like. So this is where everybody is right now, right? This is how technical specs make you feel. I'm not seeing a lot of agreement. No. Usually people don't get excited about necessarily what a technology is, but more excited about what the technology can do for you. And that's really the point of having a spec. Nobody writes a spec just to have a spec. Well, some people do, but I don't really recommend that as a life choice. It's not really something you can collect and hoard. But really what the OpenAPI spec is about is making it easier to do the things that you want to do with your API. So I like to say that having an OpenAPI spec for your API is like having a handle for your bucket. Everything you can do with a bucket, you can do with a bucket that doesn't have a handle. You can fill it, you can empty it, you can carry it around, you can put it on your head. All those things are easier to do if your bucket has a handle. Everything you can do with an API is easier to do if your API has an OpenAPI spec. So you might be saying, at this point, it's too hard to write a spec. It's boring. I don't like it. I don't like YAML or JSON. Semicolons be damned. But the nice thing about this is that there are tools that will give you a head start. We heard this morning that Kong, very shortly, will generate a spec for you from your running API. There are other tools that do that too. API Studio has one. And as someone who edited reference books for more than 50 years, I can tell you with absolute certainty it is always easier to edit something than it is to write something. So once you've got the bare bones of a spec generated for you, it's much easier to fill in the parts that can't be intuited from the running API. Like perhaps there's a parameter that you have that never gets called, in which case, why do you have it as a parameter? But let's leave that aside for now. But it'll help you fill in the blanks. So once you have your spec, either by painstaking artisanal handwriting or by this way, which I strongly encourage you to do by using an inspector and having one generated for you and then tidying it up, you can do a bunch of stuff. Obviously, when I ask people, have you used OpenAPI or Swagger, most people are using it for documentation. So this is, just bog standard Swagger UI. Wordnik itself is still on Swagger 2.0 because the shoemaker's children always go barefoot. We were actually on pre-1 up until about 6 months ago. So, we like to let technology settle for a little while. But anyway, you can use Swagger UI. You can use a whole lot of other documentation tools. Redoc is another one that lets you just upload a spec and go to town. And it makes it a lot easier and faster. Another thing that you can do once you have an OpenAPI spec is code generation. Now, it might not be the most elegant client code for your API that has ever been generated, but having some client code that works is better than having no client code at all, because when people are in the shopping mode for using your API, the lack of a client is something that will cause them to say, see ya, and move on to the next one. And also, this is a little cynical, but sometimes I think that having a not great generated client serves as a honeypot to get people to come and fix it. Again, because of the editing principle, it's easier to see what's wrong with something and edit it than it is to start from zero. So use your spec to generate some client code. It's available in I don't know how many languages now. And let your users, by what they use, show you what you need. Another thing that you can do with your OpenAPI spec is automated testing. And we heard earlier today from Chris that a lot of people do automated testing, but that's not all they do. With a spec, you can automatically generate tests for your API, and it's very simple. There are lots of tools out there that do this. There are software as a service tools. One of them is called Assertable. There's stuff that you can run locally. Dread is one. Oh, and I should let you know that every single tool and provider that I mention is in a bit.ly link that I'll show you at the end. So if you're rapidly scribbling things, you can stop now. It's okay. You'll get links to all this at the end. So Dread is something that you can run locally to do API testing. There are even services like Prism and Express Gateway that let you set up a mock server from your API spec, so you don't even have to have running code. And then there's tools like Postman, which are kind of like web desktop hybrids that let you run tests. And these are not just, hey, did I get a 200 test? But because the spec is so detailed, you can also test things like what happens when certain parameters are called? Does the response contain the data that you're expecting? It can get pretty detailed pretty quickly. And that is a good thing because it makes less work for you. And of course, gateways. We just heard this morning, which I'm very excited about, that there will soon be ways to upload a spec to Kong and get all sorts of goodies, but there are other gateways that let you do the same thing. And being able to do that, of course, means, as we heard this morning, that your docs and your API and your gateway will all be in sync. And they will all have a shared understanding about what's available, how you call it, how it works. And of course, if you have a spec, it makes it easier to add your API to API discovery portals. Rapid API is one of them, which means that more developers can find you and use you and, with any luck, pay you for the service that you spent so much time and energy and money making. Because really, when we think about it, why are we making APIs? We're not making them because, well, okay, some of us are making them because it's a fun thing to do, but most of us are making them because we want people to use them. We want to make developers' lives easier. We want to give them better access to better data and better services. We don't want to make an API that stands in the corner lonely at the API party because no one wants to talk to it because it's too hard. And it's sad, those APIs, they just don't live good lives. If you want your API to be the life of the party, give it a spec. So if you are super, super excited about APIs, and I don't know why you wouldn't be. I mean, if you don't like APIs, why are you here? Oh, maybe you like service meshes. Never mind. So if you really love APIs, there is another conference, because you can't get at a chaos conference, I heard, in Nashville, Tennessee, next week, which is API Strat. It's all about the strategy and practice of APIs. It's put on by the OpenAPI Initiative in conjunction with the Linux Foundation. There might be 1 or 2 tickets still available. Nashville is beautiful at this time of year. The food and the music are great. And it's a fun conference to be at. And so how many people now are feeling excited about using OpenAPI for something other than documentation? Yes? Yay! And also, the OpenAPI community is a very welcome and opening one. The OpenAPI community is a very open and welcoming one. The technical committee meetings are open to all. You don't have to be a member of the initiative, a corporate member, to join. The calls are usually entertaining. And if you want to have a voice in how APIs are described and used, it's a great group to join. If you don't feel like the technical committee is where you want to be, but you still want to support APIs, there's also a marketing committee. There's lots of interesting discussions going on right now about how to represent security and APIs, how to enrich how the OpenAPI Spec handles JSON with JSON schema and other flavors of JSON. So if those are things that interest you, it's really worth joining. Here's how you do it, openapis.org. Here is the link to all the resources that I mentioned during the course of this talk. So this is a cell phone slide if you want to take a picture of it. It's a very photogenic slide. The spec itself, which is linked to from the second link, is actually all up on GitHub. You can read it. It makes for delightful bedtime reading. There's not much of a plot, but the characters are great. And so I just want to thank you for letting me ramble on about OpenAPIs with you today. I deliberately kept this talk a little bit short to have a little time for questions and also not to be the last person between y'all and the bar. But I did want to point out that the images in this talk were all CC licensed, Creative Commons licensed images from Flickr, because I know that every photographer's dream is to have their image used in a talk about a technical specification, and I like to make people's dreams come true. But because of Creative Commons, this talk itself is Creative Commons licensed. So if you would like all these slides so that you can give a completely different talk using the same images in the same order, I'm happy to share this talk with you. Just email me. I'm just Erin at Wordnik. I'm very easy to find on the internet where I look like a pink robot. And I do have semicolon appreciation stickers that I will happily give you at the cocktail hour. Thank you so much for your attention.